let's get on to the queen. She's basically identical from the base to the neck as the king, except she's a little bit shorter. So we can, from this point, start to taper the heights down from the kings. Everything is shorter than the king. So four inches. So the top of the king's crown is here. I'm going to set the top of her crown just slightly lower than that. So I'm going to go 1/4 of an inch lower. Now, if you think about it, this king has that extra finial. That's why I only went a little bit lower than the top of the actual crown of the king, because the king's really going to be way taller feeling than the queen with this finial on top. So I'll go 1/4 of an inch down, and I'll go ahead and draw my center line. And my king width on the crown here was 1/2 an inch, so 2 of those squares. And that's alright for the queen. We can start with that. But you see how his line is pretty straight? It's like slightly curved at the top, but pretty much straight here. We want to add a little, I mean, this is the feminine character on the chessboard. We want to add a little bit more form. So let's do that. Let's we can go either really convex, or we can go concave. And you know, it's up to you what style you want to do. But knowing that we're going to carve kind of like a circlet on this thing, I think what I want to do is go kind of concave. I left a full 1/4 of an inch here. I'm kind of curving back really drastic, but you know, we don't have to do that. We can make it curve a little bit more out like that. Yeah. And then what I want to do is give us a place to think about. We don't want to actually do this step in design, but whenever we are actually carving the queen's crown, we're going to be taking this sharp corner and we're going to actually be cutting off pieces of it. That's how the crown is formed. So realize that this is actually going to kind of look like that. Whenever we get the crown carved, we're going to cut that little corner off in little half circles all the way around the crown. And you know what? She has a little ball right there in the center as well. So we're going to leave that there. Alright, so we brought her crown in, gave it some form. It's about just under 1/4 of an inch wide, and I keep making this line muddier and muddier, so you can't really see, but clean it up a bit. Voila. So I'm going to go ahead and add those collar beads. These on the king came out a full 1/2 inch, so let's kind of get pretty close to that on the queen. So these are about the same. We're now going to follow the same principle for creating the base. The base is going to be basically identical. So we're going to follow out 1/2 an inch up. We were 1, 2, 3.5 out here. So we're going to do the same thing. 1, 2, 3, and about 1/2 here. So we've got that same kind of idea happening. Now, if this is not looking even to you, well, that's the nature of drawing something quickly. Between the king and the queen and the other pieces, hand drawing it like this. But hey, this is a very quick way to do it. And it's a lot closer than you might think, and it's easy to adjust if I want to adjust it. So now all we need to do is draw the taper for the queen. So same as we did with the king, we want to kind of connect in here and follow it out to the top of the bead. And I always go by feel whenever it comes to designing. If I don't like something, the way something is feeling, the shape's not quite right, I'll keep messing with it. I keep adding to it, taking away, until I'm really happy with it. So I'm going to come in tighter on this curve. So once I have my curve done, come back in, cut my chamfer, and that's basically the queen's profile finished. So now that we've got the king and the queen designed, we need the bishop. So just like I said earlier in the video, these collars, they kind of help identify the pieces that represent people on the chessboard. Now, the king, the queen, the bishop, those are obviously people. The pawn also has the collar, but the rook and the knight don't have the collar. And, I mean, it's kind of odd, I guess, that you'd think the knight doesn't represent a person, but, you know, there's no place really for a collar to go. So let's zoom in here a little bit more to just where we're going to have the bishop. Now the bishop is considerably shorter. Everything from the bishop down is considerably shorter. And we have to start thinking about our end target. The end target is the pawn / rook height, because the pawn height and the rook height generally are pretty close. They're the shortest pieces on the chessboard. So I like to think about those pieces as being roughly a little bit more than half the height of a king. So if we kind of come over and bring the halfway point, you know, 2 inches up, our pawn is going to be just a little bit over 2 inches high. So that's going to be important to keep in mind. As we're making and designing the whole chess set, you need to know how drastic your drop-off is from the highest piece to the lowest piece. Okay, so let's drop down to make a mark at where our lowest point is going to be. So we kind of have an idea where we need to start on the bishop. We know it's going to be shorter than the queen, but how drastic should we go? So I'm just going to go from my baseline here up 2 inches. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 2. And that's my center line from the midway on the height point on all my tall pieces, my king, queen, and so on. That's going to be the shortest piece on the board. And really, to me, that's too short. So I want to go just a little bit higher than that for my pawn. So the pawn / rook height is going to be somewhere around 2 1/4 inches high. Between there and the height of our queen, we could almost draw a straight line if you wanted to, and you could start fitting your pieces onto that kind of graph one by one. Let's just come over a little bit and say the bishop is going to be roughly 1/2 inch lower than the queen. And then we could go 1/2 inch lower than that for the knight, and then 1/2 inch lower than that for the rook / pawn. So 1/2 inch is 2 sets of squares. So here's the top of my queen's crown. Here's a 1/2 inch down for the bishop, a 1/2 inch down for the knight, and a 1/2 inch down. We could go that drastic if we wanted to for the rook. You know what? That's too much. But if we start at the top of the ball of the queen and work it down, it actually works out. So that's okay. So let's do that. We're just starting our line up a little higher. Really, that's the line that we want. So from there, 1/2 inch down puts us right here for our bishop. So I'm going to go ahead and draw the center line on my bishop. Now, to keep the proportions right as we keep shrinking these pieces, we need to think about what the proportions were on the king and the queen. Now, I took a 2-inch base and I determined my 4-inch height on the king, right? And then I made the crown 1/4 of that total height. So really what I've done is I've divided the king into fourths. And to keep proportions correct and symmetry between all the pieces, I'm going to continue that trend down. So basically about 1/4 or whatever the height is here is going to be the amount of distance I use for the top or the head of the piece here. So if this is the top of my bishop, I'm going to go ahead and stick the little ball at the top of the bishop's mitre there. I can go through and divide this thing in half if I wanted to, then divide that into quarters. And you could do this like very specifically, you know, by measuring it all out, or as I like to do in the design process, you just kind of do it by feel, because you'll know if you like it or if you don't fairly quickly. So I'm going to go basically here and say that's exactly where the bottom of the crown is going to stop. I'm going to give myself almost a full 1/4 inch, not quite a full 1/4 inch, for where the beads go for the collar. Then of course we'll have the tapered section and then the base. Now even the base on these minor pieces, we have the major pieces, the queen and so on, they have large bases, but these minor pieces, the bishop, the knight, and so on, those, the bases should shrink in even more. So we go from having almost a 2-inch base here, it's 1 3/4, down closer to like 1 1/2 inch base. But we're just going to start a little bit off of that and say there it is. Now I know that these were like 3 1/2, but really I came out further than that. Here I just want to shrink it a little. So I'm just going to hug that third line out from the center pretty tightly. Now why am I doing this? Well, it's that visual weight thing again. We don't just want the minor pieces to be smaller, we want them to be visually less important weight-wise. We want them to have less visual weight. So I'm just going to go ahead and knock out a couple of those beads and say that's roughly the impression I want. And I'm going to go up from there to the bottom of my collar, which I've kind of used 1/4 inch and 1/4 inch as a standard here. Well, the bishop, I'm going to go under that, and I'm going to be pretty exact. I'm going to go 2/3 of 1/4 inch, so whatever that is. That's going to be where I want the neck to attach. My taper comes in from out here. Quickly draw my line. And then I'm going to draw my curve off of that line Start in here, curve it in, get a really nice form, curve it out. And then have my cut back there, which is going to be smaller than the queens as well. Everything is shrinking in size. So I'm going to clean up some of these little sketch marks so you can start to see exactly what I have in mind. I'm going to put the beads in here. That bead is a little smaller, and this bead is smaller still. And then, how do we shape the mitre? There are so many different styles that I've seen of the bishop's mitre, and some are really linear, some are more curvy. I think I want it to be narrow at the top, and then curve in quickly. Kind of a teardrop. That's pretty classic as far as shape goes. I'm going to let this actually come up even a little bit more. There we go. And that little ball be more like that. Now, like I said, we only need half. So basically the bishop is done. And it may look a little tall still, but that's the great thing about, you know, drawing like this, is that you can go in and you go, no, what? Everything is wrong, shrink all this down, or for that matter, you could stick this on a copier and shrink it down if you wanted to. Okay, so that's basically the profile of the bishop. So now we can move on to the next piece and the next piece and so on from there.